Hello and welcome to Wion World is One. I have with me a very special guest, Pierre Krahenbuhl, Commissioner General for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian refugees in the Near East, as it is called. Now, the UNRWA was established in the year 1949, soon after the creation of the State of Israel, and since then many Palestinians have come to live as refugees in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in the neighboring countries such as Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. Now, the UNRWA has done a commendable work for the refugees' welfare in terms of giving them food, education, access to healthcare, jobs and so on. But of late, the agency is facing a crisis not entirely of its own making. What is that crisis all about? Let's find out from Pierre himself. Pierre, thank you for joining us on Wion World is One. Let me ask you straight off the bat, how is the UNRWA coping with this financial crisis? Who or what brought it about in the first place?
So it's an unprecedented situation. Truly, the United States, our largest donor for decades and a very generous donor, decided early this year in January to reduce its contribution by $300 million US. So of course, as a humanitarian organization, when you lose $300 million of income and suddenly it leads you to an overall deficit of $446 million, that becomes an existential crisis. And so it was essential for us to mobilize the rest of the international community to overcome this shortfall, because we deal with human beings, with students, patients, and of course the refugee community at large. So it was essential to get down into the arena and to find solutions to this unusual and really unprecedented crisis.
Now, is the US alone responsible for this crisis? Do you think the other donors might not be contributing enough to the cause of the refugees? Or both?
Well, from a humanitarian point of view, of course, you're always looking for more support, you're always looking for more engagement, and you alluded to it in your introductory remarks. We were created in 1949 by the General Assembly of the United Nations, in a sense an expression of the collective will of the international community to support Palestine refugees. And so one would expect a support base as diverse as the political commitment to the refugees. Now, of course, because the United States was such a strong and consistent donor, we were, of course, also relying on these amounts this year and for the future. This will no longer be the case, and so we've had to find new solutions, and it's very encouraging to have seen how many countries joined the effort this year, including India.
Now, let's talk about your donors themselves now. You said the US contributed about a third of the UNRWA funding. Now, that is out of the equation, so that leaves you with the other big donors. Who might they be, and how are the Arab countries themselves in the region contributing to the upliftment or the welfare of the refugees under the current circumstances?
So this year has been very remarkable because 40 different donors and institutions increased their contributions to UNRWA to help us at this moment of crisis. You referred to the Gulf countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. Each provided $50 million US, so 200 million out of the 446 million that we were looking for came from Gulf countries. Then there was a substantial effort out of Europe, the European Union and a number of its member states, as well as Norway, Switzerland, but also Canada provided support. And then Asia was very remarkable and very encouraging. I mean, Japan has long been a partner of UNRWA. But this year, India stepped forward with a significantly increased contribution from 1 to 5 million, which came early in the year and was one of the strong initial signals that a path to overcome this crisis might actually be possible.
Let's talk a bit about the other challenges confronting the UNRWA's activities in the region. Now, recently we saw the UNGA resolutions being passed, which were critical of Israel's settlement activity. About how Israel restricts the movement of the people in terms of economic movement, economic restrictions and demolition of homes and so on. So is that an impediment, you think, in your activities on the ground?
Well, let's say that everything that is related to the conflict between Israel and Palestine and the settlement expansions, but also, of course, incursions by Israeli security forces into, for example, camp environments, refugee camp environments in the West Bank, of which there are on average 2 a day, is of course a factor that weighs heavily on the community, risks of expulsion. Here we're talking mainly of East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Gaza Strip, of course, you have a different reality. You have the blockade which is imposed on Gaza, and I was just there a couple of days ago, and you can see the weight of the pressure on the community. No freedom of movement, virtually no jobs created, and of course a level of despair that is fueled by years of conflict, and certainly no horizon also for people. This is a set of parameters that increases the needs that we have to address, and I think more fundamentally is a very big issue for the future resolution of the conflict. Now, UNRWA doesn't have a political role, but we are exposed on a daily basis to the human consequences of the unresolved conflict between Israel and Palestine.
Do you also think that built into this narrative is the fact that the US and its allies may be wanting to compel Palestine to come back to the negotiating table? Is that one of the reasons or the provocations for cutting funds in the first place?
Well, I think it is clear that what happened was that the United States announced its decision on the move of its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That led to a debate in the General Assembly, which was a very tense debate a year ago. And I think the cut to UNRWA funding was part of a series of methods of pressure on the Palestinian leadership. And this is what I regret, because of course I don't have to comment on the bilateral relations between the US and the Palestinian leadership, but the fact that humanitarian funding was included in the methods of pressure is a very regrettable politicization of humanitarian aid. Because this is, we work in environments that are difficult enough, polarized enough. And precisely what we try to ensure is that humanitarian aid is not conditioned or used as methods of pressure. So this is why I regret it, and I regret it all the more because the United States has been such a formidable partner over such a long period of time.
But Pierre, let me play the devil's advocate here. Now, the US feels and says that it requires to see transparency in the activities of UNRWA. Also the fact that it has some reservations, concerns about the fact that the status of a refugee is transferred over generations. Now, there were 40,000 to begin with 70 years ago, and today that's 5.3 or 5.4 million. So they have these concerns. How would you react to what the US has been saying on this issue?
So two issues you raised. One, the transparency. So exactly a year ago, I was in Washington for what was a very successful visit, and we signed a new cooperation agreement which laid out all the parameters from our operations, reforms, transparency. And actually, during that visit, I received a lot of recognition from very senior stakeholders. And a month later came the decision on Jerusalem and things started to change. So I don't think that there's any doubt that the United States knew very well how we operate. It was, of course, always also a critical relationship, but that's a normal relationship between a donor and a partner. Now, the other aspect that you raised, which is the question of descendants. So the original number of refugees was actually 750,000, and then today, as you rightly pointed out, 5.3 to 5.4 million. This claim that somehow Palestine refugees are treated differently in the question of descendants is actually false. And let me address it very clearly. Let's take an example from the region. Afghan refugees. After the Soviet invasion in 1979, hundreds of thousands of Afghans fled to Pakistan and Iran, among others. Now, of course, in the meantime, it's millions of people, because the descendants and the children and grandchildren of the original Afghan refugees 40 years ago are also considered by the UNHCR as refugees and assisted as such. The same for Somali refugees and others. So there's strictly no difference in the way in which UNRWA treats the question of descendants.
Let's talk about the activities of UNRWA on the ground in terms of education, healthcare, job creation, food supply of food aid. How is the cut in the funds affecting your activities on the ground today as we speak? I'm told you have cut some jobs, you are trying to cut corners in trying to make the best use of resources available. So how is it affecting the refugee ultimately on the ground in Gaza and outside?
So it was a very critical year because we were, what was at stake actually was the access to education for 530,000 Palestine refugee boys and girls that receive education in our 700 schools throughout the Near East. 3 million patients who visit our health centers every year, and emergency assistance to 1.5 million people in Syria and Gaza in particular. So that's what was at risk. Now what we did was to mobilize the international community to prevent any interruption of these services. We moved in the meantime from a shortfall of 446 million to 21. And I think that's a very successful mobilization. So thankfully, about 97 to 98% of our work was protected, including the contracts. But you're right, we regrettably had to cut in total between the West Bank and Gaza 250 staff positions out of course, the total of our 30,000 employees. The numbers are not so large, but for the individuals, and I just met with some of our colleagues in Gaza recently who lost their jobs, and of course it's a catastrophe at personal level, because it's not only that you will not find an alternative employment in Gaza because of the conflict dynamics, but you are also protecting your family and extended families through the one salary. And this of course is having a knock-on effect which is very serious for people.
If the US does not increase its share of contribution, if the other countries do not step up and volunteer more money to the UNRWA, how long can the UNRWA continue its activities on the ground? For how many more months or years going forward?
So it's a very important point, because the United States will not contribute going forward. They made it clear in a communication at the end of the month of August this year that they will no longer fund UNRWA for the foreseeable future. So we had to look for these other alternatives. And again, here I'm extremely grateful, for example, to India for the increase which allowed us, together with the other supporters, to open our school year on time. This was really incredibly important. Now, the solutions that we will be looking to in 2019 is to stabilize the levels of funding at the same level as 2018. That's crucial so that we have some stability. And in the meantime, we will look for alternative and complementary funding from new donors, develop new relations. Also in the private sector, of course, this is part of our ongoing efforts. The issue of UNRWA's longer-term sustainability is actually very much related to the dynamics of negotiation. In the absence of a just solution that includes the issue of refugees.
Just political solution?
Just political solution.
One state or two state solution?
Well, the current consensus is, of course, an international consensus, especially the UN's position is a position based on the two-state solution, and that should be the framework. But for us, what is important is that it is inclusive of the refugee concerns. If that is the case, then the vision should be that at one point UNRWA transitions to an independent authority that would be the Palestinian Authority in a fully independent sense. That was the vision after the Oslo Peace Agreement. I think it should remain. The vision should not be for Palestine refugees to continue to be serviced by a UN body forever, but that can only happen if a just political solution is found.
Is it your submission that there is a crisis at hand, but it is not yet a full-blown emergency?
This year was a critical emergency for us. It was existential because as a humanitarian organization, people have to understand we don't have reserves, we don't have money that is stocked there in reserves that we can just release at a time of crisis. 446 million. I doubt that you will find in the history of humanitarian organizations a bigger financial crisis. And therefore, the satisfaction that we've had is that so many countries concerned about the dignity of refugees, concerned about regional stability and the future of multilateralism, came to our support in this year of crisis. That's a formidable message also to the refugees. You are not forgotten by the world, despite all the challenges that we currently face internationally.
Great. All right, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to Wion World is One. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.